former President Donald Trump, who has seemingly captured the hearts and minds of the Bitcoin industry. You laid out all of these policies before, and we've seen echoes of that in the policies that he has proposed. I would love for you to compare and contrast a bit your policies and his, and speak to whether you think that his passion for Bitcoin now is genuine or if it's more political posture.
Well, I can't look into President Trump's head, so I assume that people mean what they say. First of all, and I'm very happy, I couldn't be more happy that President Trump is now publicly at least committed to Bitcoin. It's a new issue for him. He has not been committed to it in the past. He's talked about Bitcoin as a scam. Steve Mnuchin, who was his former Secretary of the Treasury, also tried to end any kind of person-to-person transactions with Bitcoin. He initiated the war on Bitcoin. And so I think we need to be cautious. I hope he understands the importance to the Bill of Rights and personal freedoms. But, President Trump also had the power for 4 years to pardon Ross Ulbricht, to pardon Edward Snowden, to pardon Julian Assange, and he didn't do it. So again, I think the people that he tends to listen to are people who are deeply embedded in these intelligence agencies, in the Fed bureaucracies, and in the war machine, and the money printing industry. And I'm worried that about his capacity to exercise independent judgments, and to really get to study these issues in ways that you can make a deep personal commitment to it, that gives you the capacity to stand up to very, very convincing, very persuasive, very powerful bureaucracies.
This is a day of affirmation, a celebration of liberty. We stand here in the name of freedom. We are committed to peaceful and nonviolent change. We must recognize the full human equality of all of our people, not just to those of a particular religion, not just to those of a particular race, not just to the wealthy, but to all of the people. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do.
A new twist this morning for the country's most famous political dynasty.
RFK Jr. plans
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
on October 9th in the state
that it's time to heal a divided nation and return the power to the people.
Robert Kennedy Jr.
We are told today that our nation is hopelessly divided. But I found something different as I travel this country. I have witnessed an upwelling of optimism that I've never seen before. Something is stirring in us that says it doesn't have to be this way. And so I've come here today to declare our independence from the tyranny of corruption, which robs us of affordable lives, our belief in the future, and our respect for each other. But to do that, I must first declare my own independence. Independence from the Democratic Party and from all other political parties. I haven't made this decision lightly. It's very painful for me to let go of the party of my uncles, my father, my grandfather, and both of my great-grandfathers. But my sacrifice is nothing compared to the risk our founding fathers took when they signed the Declaration of Independence 247 years ago. They knew that if their revolution failed, every last one of them would be hanged. They chose to place everything on the line. When John Adams put his pen down after adding his signature to the Declaration, he turned to those present And he said to them, sink or swim, live or die, survive or perish. From this day on, I am with my country. I'm going to make that same pledge to you today so that I can stand before you, as every leader should stand before you, free of partisan allegiance, free from the backroom deals, a servant only to my conscience, to my Creator, and to you. Every president enters office promising to unite the nation and to work with people from the other party across the aisle. None of them ever does it. They can't. They're already chosen a side. Well, I'm not going to have that problem. I'm going to build coalitions from both sides of the aisle. And except for the small minority of public officials who are actually corrupt, I'm going to tell you this secret. They too want liberation from the system that has captured them. And isn't that ultimately what we all want? Liberation from a system that robs us of our wealth, our health, our hope, our patriotism, our ideals, our freedoms, and ultimately our sense of ourselves as a good and capable people. Is healing our divided nation possible? Let's go take back our country. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
I am a real American, fight for the rights of every man. I am a real American, fight for what's right, fight for your life.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the next President of the United States, Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Hello, Bitcoiners. I am so glad to be back for my second Bitcoin conference. Since last year in Miami, I've been meeting with leaders and thinkers from this community. I've conferred with Bitcoin miners, with policymakers, with economists, with financial experts, with investors and developers and entrepreneurs to deepen my understanding of the extraordinary promise of Bitcoin for our country and for our planet. After all I've learned, I intend, as President of the United States, to sign an executive order on day one, directing the Department of Justice and the U.S. Marshals to transfer the approximately 200,000 Bitcoin held by the U.S. government to the United States Treasury, where it will be held as a strategic asset. On day one as president, I will sign another executive order directing the U.S. Treasury to purchase 550 Bitcoin daily until the U.S. has built a reserve of at least 4 million Bitcoins. And a position of dominance that no other country will be able to usurp. Our nation holds approximately 19% of global gold reserves. This policy will give us about the same proportion of total Bitcoin. The cascading impact from these actions will eventually move Bitcoin to a valuation of hundreds of trillions of dollars. On day one as president, I will sign also an executive order directing the IRS to issue public guidelines that all transactions between Bitcoin and the US dollar are unreportable transactions. And by extension, non-taxable. On day one as president, I will also sign an executive order directing the IRS to treat Bitcoin as an eligible asset for 1031 exchange into real property. Now, I want to say a couple of words about my observations about the Bitcoin community, which I consider myself part of. Despite their different viewpoints, I found the most striking feature of Bitcoin community is this kind of paradoxical juxtaposition marked by fierce divisions on several minor issues and an overwhelming sense of unity within the larger Bitcoin ecosystem. The Bitcoin community reminds me of how American politics ought to be, fiercely diverse, but ultimately united in our aspirations and our belief in our country and in our convictions that America is worth the fight. And in the end, we all come back together, united in our belief that Bitcoin is a technology for freedom, for optimism, for independence, for democracy and transparency. It is the currency of hope. It is the perfect currency. It is an elegant, poetic, beautiful, pure species that aligns perfectly with the highest ideals and aspirations represented by the American experiment with self-governance. It is incorruptible, it has integrity, it has self-sovereignty, it promotes personal responsibility and accountability, it is decentralized and democratic, it is small on government and large on personal freedom. Bitcoin is anti-war. It is a fierce, merciless, and insurmountable foe of government corruption. Now, many of you know my own introduction to Bitcoin, my own conversion. I knew from my children about Bitcoin, but it was it seemed almost to me something like a fad or a novelty. And then I saw what happened in Ottawa. I was running at that time the Children's Health Defense, which was the premier advocate for medical freedom in our country. And we had embedded with the striking truckers in Canada, a reporter for our newsletter, and she was traveling with the truckers from Alberta all the way to Ottawa. And the truckers are very diverse in Canada. They're Asian, they're black, they're white. The trucking strike, the truckers were doing something that all of us in our country take for granted. They were assembling to petition their government about something that they thought was important, which was that the impacts, the financial impacts of the mandates on their businesses. If you look at the videos of that event, it was like Woodstock. People were giving out water bottles, they were picking up trash, they were playing music, they were being kind to each other. But it was portrayed by the Canadian government as a right-wing, extremist, violent terror organization. And the government began using facial recognition systems and other forms of surveillance to learn the identity of the truckers, looking at their license plates, et cetera. And then it froze their bank accounts. and it froze their $12 million PayPal account. And when Canada did that, it occurred that the premier template of democracy in the world besides the United States, it occurred to me immediately that transactional freedom was as important as freedom of expression in the First Amendment. Because if the government has the capacity, none of these truckers were charged with a crime, much less convicted. And yet the government was able to shut down their bank accounts. They couldn't pay their mortgages. They couldn't buy diesel for their trucks. They couldn't buy food for their children. One trucker told me that he was going to jail because he couldn't make mandatory alimony payments. And if a government is able to starve you, to evict you from your home, if you speak out against it, if you criticize government policies, then we are on the road to totalitarianism and slavery. And I began at that time looking seriously for alternatives, and it was that incident that led me immediately to grasp the potential of this technology to provide transactional freedom and self-sovereignty. Last year at this conference, I proposed that as your president, I would fight to ensure the right to self-custody Bitcoin, to run nodes in our own homes, to stop the federal government from usurping the First Amendment rights to open source, privacy-enhancing technologies. I pledged to prevent government officials from adopting CBDCs, which would inevitably morph into what we saw in Canada, a malevolent tool for surveillance and control. Most importantly, I promised to secure the United States position as the global hub of cryptocurrency, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and investment, and technology. As a lifelong environmentalist, I embrace Bitcoin as a mechanism for incentivizing greater investments in green and renewable energy production. After the time I spent with Bitcoiners last year, I left the Miami conference so enthralled with optimism and excitement about Bitcoin and its potential to eliminate the national debt as a hedge against inflation, its promise to guarantee personal freedom, to restore the American middle class, to end government corruption, to defund the war machine, and to protect our environment. And I happened just before that, at Miami convention, I got a big check from the fees from winning the Monsanto case. And I took most of that check, which represented the largest portion of my personal wealth, and I invested it all in Bitcoin. Now, I didn't do that with the hopes for a quick return on investment. I was told you might have to wait a long time, and you might have to have a lot of anxiety and angina. So I was prepared for that. But if that had been my sole motive, by the way, I would not have been disappointed. Because I got in it with good timing. But over the past year, I've gone even further down the rabbit hole. Let me put it, the orange rabbit hole. I'm convinced now more than ever that we have to work together to put all these proposals into action immediately. America's at a crossroads. We can either continue down the path we are on, racking up debt, constricting freedom, addicted to war, or we can look forward to use new technologies like Bitcoin to help us evolve, to achieve again our promise as a moral authority and the world's exemplar for incorruptible democratic governance. Now, I'm very happy to learn that I'm not the only one talking about Bitcoin in this year's election. Nothing could make me more joyful than to see other political leaders now jumping on the Bitcoin bandwagon. I've had over a year's head start to study, to understand, to articulate the potential of Bitcoin. And my goal as the first Bitcoin president will be to enact policies that will make America the world's greatest representative for Bitcoin and a proponent of its democratic values. I grew up assuming that America would always maintain its status as the world leader, the leader of the free world. But ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1993, we've paradoxically been moving in a declining spiral away from that role. Hubris, military adventurism, and corruption have put America's political and economic power in precipitous decline. Our dollar is rapidly losing its reserve currency status because we've weaponized it against other countries. When we disagree with the policies of another country, we kick them off the SWIFT system and we debank them. As a predictable result of that strategy, the BRICS nations are now in the process of de-dollarizing by getting off the petrodollar. They realize that trading their commodities and other hard resources for money that is printed out of thin air is a losing proposition. This trend will likely accelerate until we make the tough transition toward backing our debt obligations with hard assets again. I have a plan to strengthen the US dollar and lower the interest rates and neutralize our $34 trillion debt by backing US Treasury bills, notes, and bonds with hard assets, including a combination of precious metals and Bitcoin. Backing U.S. debt obligations by collateralizing them with hard assets not only restores strength to the dollar, it reins in inflation, and it will usher in a new era of American financial stability, prosperity, and peace. The world needs to believe that we have safely handcuffed our government and its ability to create money out of thin air with no proof of work. The innovative strategy that I'm proposing leverages the scarcity and liquidity of Bitcoin, along with gold and other hard assets, to restore the dollar's dominance in global finance. The world will rush to adopt an American-backed, decentralized currency that cannot be confiscated by governments, that can be traded and transacted on cell phones at the speed of light across every global border with no banking fees or other transactional friction. This incorruptible currency will immediately start pulling wealth and assets from every other nation around the globe back into the United States, restoring the strength of our dollar and repairing our balance of payments. 6 months before his assassination, my uncle President John F. Kennedy, signed an executive order that put silver coins in competition with the notes issued by the Fed. His intention was to rein in Fed discretion. He had been a critic of Fed policy, and he hoped to end the discretionary monetary policy and the inevitable debasement of the US dollar. He understood that a highly leveraged economy leads directly to the destructive kind of wealth inequality that is today eroding American democracy and generating violence and division and discontent and hopelessness. Notably, after my uncle's assassination, the government immediately stopped issuing those silver coins and power returned to the Fed. My uncle apparently understood the potential for the Fed to evolve itself into a tyranny. Bitcoin has the potential to return monetary discipline to the Fed and to restore the dollar as the unchallenged global reserve currency. And just as Bitcoin can fortify the dollar, it can also secure America's position in cyberspace. I understand that tomorrow President Trump may announce his plan to build a Bitcoin Fort Knox and authorize the U.S. government to buy 1 million Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. And I applaud that announcement, and we should all applaud it. I hope that President Trump's commitment to Bitcoin is more than political expediency. The most cynical political reason for endorsing Bitcoin is to excite the 60 million Bitcoin American holders by policies that make the number go up. But it's my hope that President Trump and the DNC nominee, who he or she may be, will develop a deeper understanding of the earth-shaking reasons to ensure that Bitcoin has a strategic reserve in the U.S. Treasury. The most compelling of those reasons is laid out in U.S. Space Force major Jason Lowery's MIT thesis entitled Software. Major Lowery points out that Bitcoin has been mischaracterized as money, when in fact it is a cyber defense system that will protect our online identities and data in cyberspace. Just as we have an Air Force to protect our skies and a Navy to protect our seas, Bitcoin can protect us against potential cyber attacks. It is a cyber defense weapon and a classic example of unrecognized use. Here's an analogous example. The Chinese invented gunpowder, and then they used it as medicine for 200 years before other countries recognized that it was the most potent tool for power projection. Today, the popularly assumed use of Bitcoin is money. But Bitcoin is also a power projection weapon that can protect our currency and everything that we do online from cyber attacks. The first country that recognizes this function will be the new global superpower. We need to grab the reins and harness Bitcoin's full potential if we want to regain and consolidate our title as leader of the free world. Based on public information, the USA currently owns 204,000 Bitcoins, the fifth largest Bitcoin wallet in the world. Adding Bitcoin to that reserve will help secure the future of the United States for the next 250 years. One of my first hires in the Kennedy administration would be Major Lowery as my top advisor. As my top advisor for my national security team. Another important use of Bitcoin for America and the world is the one that is dearest to my heart, capturing carbon and incentivizing green energy production through Bitcoin mining. I served for 40 years as an environmental champion and for a decade as a partner in the green tech venture capital firm Vantage Point, which is the #1 green tech energy and technology firm in the world. I played key roles in developing some of the world's largest solar and wind power generation projects. Critics of Bitcoin have wrongly cast it as an environmental threat because of its high energy demand. The opposite, of course, is true. Bitcoin miners are more sensitive to energy pricing than any other industry. This means that they can only survive in the marketplace by utilizing the cheapest energy, and that invariably means waste energy and surplus power. For example, methane from landfills would otherwise go into the atmosphere, but Bitcoin miners are uniquely able to harness it as an energy source. Bitcoin mining is also the ideal partner for renewable energy and variable power projects like wind and solar. My personal experience in energy project finance left me with a deep appreciation for the critical potential for Bitcoin mining as a reliable profit center for renewable energy projects that need flexible, on-site, off-peak customers for intermittent energy generation in order to get financing. Bitcoin miners are the ideal partners for these kind of projects. All right, let's lean into some of the other ways that Bitcoin is good for Americans and for America. President Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971 to finance the Vietnam War. Since then, the dollar's purchasing power has been in precipitous decline, eroding savings and earnings of everyday Americans. Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Fed for 20 years, even warned that, quote, in the absence of a gold standard, there is no way to prevent savings from confiscation through inflation, end quote. Inflation, as we all know, is theft, and it's almost always theft from the poor. The Fed has engineered an uber-efficient money printing machine to perpetrate the systematic robbery that has gutted the American middle class and decimated America's working poor. The obscene money printing has drained our citizens of their purchasing power through the hidden tax of inflation. And it was the Trump and Biden administration's reckless embrace of money printing that have pushed the middle class over the tipping point now. American households are now buckling under the strain. Let's look at it simply. If you had $1,000 6 years ago, that $1,000 has a value of $520 today in terms of its capacity to purchase goods and services. Mortgages have doubled in 4 years. No wonder half of the 18 to 30-year-olds are still living at home, unable to afford the homes that provide the first step toward the American dream. No wonder our younger Americans are marrying later, delaying or even abandoning the choice to start a family. Their dwindling purchasing power forces them into these sacrifices. The hopelessness of the task of steadily growing savings, which we all assumed that was just part of our lives, it has pushed. And now today, this generation is facing these moving goalposts. They make money, they think they're doing well, and then the money disappears. And not for anything they did, but because inflation. And it has pushed this whole generation into a kind of financial nihilism. And it's contributed to the epidemics of depression, of suicide, of hopelessness, of alienation, of dispossession, of the loss of pride in our country, the loss of hope for their own generation and their own futures among young Americans. Healthcare costs are also increasing exponentially. I talked a couple of months ago with a young New Hampshire couple, and they told me with tears in their eyes how they had gotten in an argument, the husband and wife, holding a crying baby in their arms at night and having to wonder about whether that baby was $50 sick or $100 sick or $500 sick before they brought him to the emergency room. Over half of Americans cannot put their hands on $1,000 if they have emergency. If you are part of that cohort and the engine light goes on in your car, it is the apocalypse, because you know you're not going to be able to afford the mechanic. You won't be able to get to work. You won't be able to pay your rent, and then you're going to be out on the sidewalk. And that decile has ended up with this army, tent encampments in the cities that I live in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, and all over the country, where armies of Americans, of hardworking Americans, are now living because the engine light came on in their car, or they got 2 flat tires at once, or they had some other expense that was unanticipated. Walk outside and you're going to see it. Time and again, I'm hearing from elderly Americans about how they cut their prescription pills in two to make them last at the end of the week. They're choosing between gasoline and home heating oil and food. So many mothers have told me that they're downgrading ingredients to get out the grocery store checkout line. Americans today are being forced to make these gut-wrenching decisions because our money is broken. For the beleaguered American middle class, Bitcoin is the off-ramp from the inflation highway of doom. If the world were on a Bitcoin standard and our money held its value, we would all have the ability to live more abundant lives. Bitcoiners have it right. Fix the money, fix the world. The discipline of tying our dollars to hard assets like Bitcoin will also finally break our addiction to forever wars. Fiat currency was invented to fund war. As I pointed out just now, President Nixon got us off the gold standard in 1971 because printing fiat currency was the only way to continually finance the Vietnam War. Prior to fiat currency, when a country ran out of money, the war would end. Or if a government wanted to fund a war, it would issue war bonds and borrow the money from its citizens, or it would tell them in advance, we're going to tax you. Today, governments don't need to even ask that permission. They just print the money. And then they fund the war with fake money. If the world was on a Bitcoin standard, then there would be no war because the governments can't print Bitcoin. I'm a proponent of Bitcoin because it can defund the military-industrial complex that is bent not on national defense, but on international global domination. And I'll say this, during the height of the Cold War, the military budget was about $500 billion in 2024 dollars. Today, it's double that. Why do we need twice the money that we needed during the height of the Cold War? Well, we need it because it has nothing to do with national defense. It has to do with global hegemony and international domination that is actually counterproductive. It's bankrupting us at home. And it has destroyed our relationships and our moral authority across the globe. Oh, let me say it again. If governments couldn't print money with a couple of keystrokes on a computer, they wouldn't be able to fund wars that never end. Again, fix the money, fix the world. And make no mistake, one of the main reasons my administration will fix our broken money is to defund the war machine. To reach that goal, I'm going to support making direct ownership of Bitcoin tax-free. The conversion of Bitcoin back into dollars will be non-reportable transaction to the IRS and not subject to capital gains. We have to remember that the Fourth Amendment guarantees the right to privacy. As a constitutionalist, I'm adamant defender of our right to financial and transactional privacy. When U.S. citizens are required to report every Bitcoin transaction to the IRS, the government knows everything that we are doing with our money. Governments have no business knowing your business. More importantly, making the direct ownership of Bitcoin tax-free creates financial incentive to own Bitcoin and not a Bitcoin ETF, which is a security and therefore subject to capital gains. This is crucial because direct ownership of Bitcoin keeps it decentralized. And that is the only way to prevent BlackRock and other global asset managers from having undue influence over the Bitcoin network, over its forks, and over its upgrades. In 2014, the IRS declared Bitcoin to be property and regulated the purchase and sale as a capital transaction. It's important to understand that this tax law was never passed by Congress, and it was never signed into law by the President of the United States. The IRS and the SEC simply usurped government power in order to suppress decentralized financial democracy. The U.S. Supreme Court recently, of the Chevron doctrine, reopens that decision. And that decision has allowed freedom-fighting Bitcoiners to challenge the constitutionality of taxing Bitcoin for the 2024 year. I'm telling you today that I will never, ever sign a law that taxes direct ownership of Bitcoin. I will use my power to reverse any law that does so. I will end the Biden administration's war on Bitcoin. Tax-free Bitcoin is not only critical for citizens' financial autonomy, freedom, and privacy, it is essential to keep it decentralized and democratic as Satoshi created it to be. Finally, Bitcoin guarantees property rights. With freely transactable Bitcoin, no government will be able to confiscate or tax your wealth at the border. This is another example of Bitcoin's potency as a weapon against totalitarianism. So as this election cycle starts to heat up, you have choices to make. You've heard what I propose to do. Let's compare that to what my Republican opponent proposes. And I welcome President Trump's new enthusiasm for Bitcoin, but he's only weeks into the Bitcoin dialogue. And I have the advantage of being here longer. And hopefully his learning curve will mirror the kind that I went through. My guess is that initially, at least, there's going to be a lot of talk about pricing and how a change in government policies can make Bitcoiners wealthy. But we all know that that is just one of the minor points to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is about something much bigger. Bitcoin is about our souls. It's about our values. The price go up feature is the least of all of its attributes. President Trump has a long way to go to explain how his personal values align with those of Bitcoiners. If he doesn't do that, then we don't really have any assurance, do we, that his endorsement is not another ephemeral monetary policy fad du jour. That assurance will require him to repudiate some of the central policies of his last administration. During his years in the White House, President Trump had consistently spoke out against Bitcoin. In December of 2020, he was openly hostile to Bitcoin and tried to outlaw self-custody wallets. This was a time when Americans, particularly, more than any time in our history, needed any store of value that they could get to compensate for the hits to their income from the lockdowns, from the declining purchasing power due to the money printing orgy and the COVID closures of all of our businesses. In 2021, President Trump doubled down and declared that Bitcoin, it just seems like a scam I don't like it because it's another currency competing against the dollar. I'm happy that President Trump has had this evolution. I'm proud that I helped blaze a trail that made it easier for other political leaders to follow. And I'm grateful to the 50 or 60 million Bitcoiners like Michael Saylor who were there before me and helped me understand the nation-saving potential of Bitcoin. Every Bitcoiner I know shares my own yearning for freedom, for my skepticism toward official orthodoxies and pronouncements, and an inclination for critical thinking that I most admire. During COVID, neither President Trump nor President Biden protected our constitutional rights. They both restricted our right to assemble, to worship. They closed our churches, no funeral for grandma, no weddings. They closed our businesses without due process or just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment. They ended the Seventh Amendment right to jury trials. They assaulted the Fourth Amendment prohibition against warrantless searches and seizures, and also both these administrations allowed the FBI and the spy agencies to suppress our rights to free speech by working with social media companies to deplatform people who criticize government policies. I hope that President Trump's change of heart in Bitcoin is evidence of a newfound and deep-seated commitment to personal freedoms, to our Constitution, to our Bill of Rights. Will President Trump fight for Bitcoin if he's elected? I wish he had mentioned Bitcoin in the RNC speech last week. I'm disappointed. He spent a lot of the last week attacking President Bukele of El Salvador, the only country on a Bitcoin standard. President Bukele is the most popular president in El Salvador's history, and with Bitcoin's help, he has turned the country around. Bitcoin helped him grow the economy and reduce crime. The U.S. should want to take a page from President Bukele's playbook and learn some of the lessons that he has to teach us about Bitcoin. And even more alarming, President Trump, in an interview last month with Bloomberg, floated the idea of bringing on Jamie Dimon as his Secretary of Treasury. I'm grateful that President Trump yesterday walked back that comment, but I'm not sure how he could have ever considered bringing on one of the biggest long-time critics of Bitcoin and the world's ultimate advocate for centralized control, if he truly is committed in his soul to the freedom and decentralization that we all are committed to. Those choices don't match the spiritual alignment of Bitcoin. Bitcoin represents, personally, I would rather see somebody like Michael Saylor or Caitlin Long as Treasury Secretary. They are brilliant, they are encyclopedic, they're forward-thinking, they deeply love our country, and they represent the ideals of decentralization and economic democracy. Finally, President Trump has had 4 years to pardon Ross Ulbricht and Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, and he didn't do it. And we need to ask ourselves why. I've already looked into those cases, and I plan on pardoning them all on day one. In this election year, I encourage you to study your choices, look at the candidate's policy, but more importantly, look at their actions to decide if they are genuinely part of the problem or if they're part of the solution. Decide if they align with what you believe in your heart. Remember, Americans need, and remember what Americans need and what we want, and then vote accordingly. I want to leave you today with a core belief in Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin community. Bitcoin is the currency of freedom, the currency of liberty, the currency of hope. It restores self-sovereignty back to the individual, which is the whole purpose of American democracy. It gives us digital property rights, which is the core of our democracy. And it provides a store of value that will allow middle-class Americans to live in abundance again. I want to be the president who can bring back hope. And I'm grateful to be part of your Bitcoin community. In fact, I don't think of myself as red. I don't think of myself as blue, and I don't even think of myself as purple. Those are the colors of the political parties. Instead, I think of myself as orange. That is the color of freedom. And it's true that President Trump has orange hair. And I can only admire him for that from afar. I'll never be able to match him on that. It's a really great start, but I have an orange heart, and that's what you should support. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.
Well, it's the hottest party in the country, folks. The 2024 Bitcoin conference in Nashville underway right now. The speaker lineup headed, of course, by former President Trump speaking tomorrow. Russell Brand is there, Edward Snowden, Vivek Ramaswamy, and my next guest, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Robert, welcome to the show. Now, you launched your campaign last year at that Bitcoin Miami conference. Why have you been so attached to this Bitcoin blockchain movement?
You know, Charles, when I knew a little bit about Bitcoin, and I actually got introduced to it after the Ottawa trucker strike, when the government of Ottawa shut down everybody's bank account who was participating in a peaceful public protest. And I realized that transactional freedom was as important as freedom of speech, because if the government can starve you to death and get you thrown out of your home and make it so you can't buy gasoline without ever charging you with a crime, without ever convicting you of a crime, just because you complained about a government policy, then freedom of speech is meaningless. Bitcoin clearly was an answer to that, and that's what brought me to that Miami conference. I left that conference utterly enthusiastic about the capacity of Bitcoin to solve a whole host of other problems, cybersecurity problems. It is the currency of freedom. It gives transparency to government. It democratizes our government. It's a hedge against inflation. It's an off-road to these terrible $34 trillion deficit that it can save us from. And it stops money from a government from just printing money, which is the only way to really end war. The government, as long as the government can print unlimited amounts of money without ever asking us if they can tax us, the wars are going to continue forever. So there are so many benefits to it. I actually left that Miami conference, and I had just received my check for my fees from the Monsanto case, and I put almost all of that into Bitcoin, which represented a large part of my own net worth. I didn't do that to make money, although I ended up making substantial money. I did it because of the association with Bitcoin, with personal freedom, right, with transparency, right, with democracy, all the things that that we ought to be working toward.
You know, one of the ironies, as you were telling the story, the truckers, that up in the skyscraper in the penthouse, one of the biggest central bankers in the world lodged the complaint because of the noise. You can't make this stuff up. I know you spent a lot of.
True? I didn't know
It
that.
is, yeah. I forgot the dude's name, but he's huge. He's like one of the world's greatest central bankers, and the truckers are making too much noise. Cut him off. I know you spent a lot of today dismissing reports of dropping out, endorsing Donald Trump. But I want to also shift because you were certified in Nebraska, and this is over Democratic Party opposition. So many Americans are saying that your former party, the nominating process, the anointment of Vice President Harris, that the whole thing has become un-American. That's a thread that's been your message from day one. What are your thoughts that more and more people are agreeing with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, the whole kind of the central focus of the Democratic Party was making sure that every American could vote for whoever they wanted to vote for. The Democratic Party today is all about the opposite of that, about making sure that candidates who are going to run against their chosen candidate that the legal system, that the law enforcement agencies are used to prevent those candidates from running. They made it almost impossible for me to get on the ballot in all the states. I am going to. In fact, we have now completed all the signatures. I think we have one state left where we have a couple hundred signatures. We've gotten over 2 million signatures, more signatures than any presidential candidate in history. We've done something nobody in history has been able to do, up against the headwinds that they've created for us. They're suing us in all the states, but we're going to win the lawsuits. But it's not a good look for the Democratic Party. They're saying, well, we have to do this in order to save democracy from Donald Trump. But they're actually, the real argument is we're destroying democracy in order to save it. It's a paradox.
They kicked you out, then they took the Biden voters and kicked them out. And I've got less than a minute to go, and I hate to rush you, but I got to get your thoughts on this because you brought up how Bitcoin can help us also mitigate or avoid wars. There was a tweet by Douglas McGregor that you retweeted, and essentially it's suggesting that if you look at the way things are going with UK and French trainers being intercepted by Russian missiles and Russian fighters, that we're being drawn into this. At some point, the West is going to be drawn into this war beyond just writing checks, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're already being drawn into it. And, Putin's demand, we have the opportunity twice to settle this war on terms that were very, very good for the American people. In April of 2022, President Putin and President Zelensky signed an agreement that was refereed by Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, and also the Prime Minister of Turkey. It was a great agreement. All Putin really wanted was us to keep NATO pledged and not put NATO into Ukraine, which is a legitimate demand by him. He was withdrawing his troops after initialing that treaty, and President Biden sent Boris Johnson over there to force Zelensky to tear up the treaty. Since then, 600,000 Ukrainian kids have died for a reason nobody should have died. And we're now on the brink of closer to nuclear exchange than any time since 1962. And I remember that Cuban Missile Crisis very like it was yesterday. And it is shocking to me that there are people in the White House that are allowing this to happen.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you've blazed a hell of a trail, and you've opened a lot of eyes. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Charles.
All right, see you soon.
As we just sat down with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, the independent presidential candidate who's been getting a lot of attention for reports that he was considering dropping out and endorsing former President Donald Trump. He has denied those reports earlier this morning, and I asked him to detail whether or not he's had any conversations with the former president about a possible endorsement. I want you to listen to his response. You denied reports this morning that you're ending your campaign and endorsing Donald Trump, but I know you've acknowledged that you've had conversations with him in the past. Have they ever involved conversations of an endorsement?
I'll talk. No, and I never intended to get out of the campaign. That's just fake news. I don't know.
But you've never discussed an endorsement with him.
Who's putting that out? I will meet with anybody. So I have no plans to endorse any other candidate. I'm in it to win it. Our donations are way up. Our social engagement are 1,000% since President Biden dropped out. Our volunteers are up. Our email engagement is up. Everything, we have tremendous momentum right now, and, we intend to win this campaign.
Is there anything that would cause you to endorse Donald Trump? Anything he said?
Not that I can think of.
Now, I did press him on reports that he talked to Donald Trump about a White House job overseeing health policy in exchange for an endorsement. He told me that he would not detail private conversations. He repeated that a couple of different times. Now, if he were to endorse Donald Trump, it would be quite a change in tone for him. He said last year of Donald Trump, our positions on certain fundamental issues, our approaches to governance, excuse the audio issue in the hall here, our approaches to governance and our philosophies of leadership could not be further apart. So it would be quite a pivot for him to then endorse the former president. Again, he's saying he's not doing that right now. On Bitcoin, that's why he's here. He's giving a speech in a little under an hour, and he talked about the need for the U.S. to have a strategic reserve of Bitcoin in order to, in his opinion, help leverage paying off the national debt. I also asked him about accessibility to Bitcoin. He owns more than $1 million worth of Bitcoin today, and that is not a wealth growing opportunity that many people have access to. I asked him how that can change, and here's what he said.
People ought to be able to transact, that they ought to be able to buy it easily, put it in their wallet without government asking them what they're doing, and it's going to democratize our country and democratize our monetary system.
Now, the Democratic Party does have a presence here, but nowhere near as visible or as robust as the Republican Party, which seems to be embracing crypto and trying to court this audience to maybe garner some votes this fall, guys.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how cryptocurrency is growing in this presidential race. National correspondent James Packard for us in Nashville. James, thank you.
Now to our friend Major Garrett's news-making interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the independent presidential candidate. We'll tell you about the polling first. It estimates that Kennedy is at around 6% of the national vote, which is well enough to make a difference in battleground states if, and that's the key part here, he gets on the ballots in those states. Kennedy is an environmental lawyer, of course. He's also the son of the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and his campaign slogan is this: people before politics, country before party. But his words, what he says out there on the campaign trail, many people file it in the category of divisive nonsense. He spent years spreading false claims about vaccines, COVID, even the September 11th attacks. He sat down, as I mentioned, with Major Garrett.
Why do you want to be president?
I feel like our country has gone off the rails. Both political parties have lost track of what America's supposed to look like.
Since launching his campaign in April of last year, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has cast himself as an anti-establishment option in a political universe dominated by corporate interests and compliant politicians who cling to power. This includes, he told us, President Biden.
I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, and I commend him and respect him for the 50 years that he gave in service to our country. But I think he tarred that reputation and that career over the past year by refusing to let go of power. So I think part of our traditions is that our leaders relinquish power, and that they do that graciously. And no, I don't think that President Trump did that graciously, and I don't think President Biden did either.
As for Trump, Kennedy's relationship with the former president grabbed headlines when they met at the GOP convention in Milwaukee. The Washington Post reported he spoke with Trump about leaving the race and endorsing the Republican ticket. And this video of RFK Jr. on the phone with Trump shortly after the attempt on his life heightened the drama.
I would love you to do so, and I think it'll be so good for you and so big for you, and we're going to win.
Were you in those meetings prepared to end your campaign, endorse former President Trump, and accept a role in his administration?
No. President Trump called me a few hours after the assassination.
Was that ever any part of the discussion, those things I just described?
I won't talk about exactly what we discussed because it would be a violation of trust.
Kennedy's campaign now has Secret Service protection approved following the Trump rally shooting. It's a risk inextricably tied to RFK Jr., whose father and uncle were assassinated in the 1960s. He told us his team had previously been paying for security out of pocket. One reason, he said, the campaign is $3 million in debt.
I'm the first candidate since my father died that has requested Secret Service protection and to whom it's been denied. So, of course, we're struggling for money, but we're getting the money and our campaign is viable.
From whom do you believe you will draw more votes, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump?
Well, I hope to draw votes from both of them. Right now, I draw many more votes from President Trump than from the Democrats. Is he happy with that? Is President Trump happy? He isn't happy. And in fact, the RNC, I told him that when I saw him. And he was like, yeah, we got to do something about that.
Critics have accused Kennedy of peddling conspiracy theories with comments like these.
I see somebody on a hiking trail carrying a little baby, and I say to him, better not get him vaccinated.
But he told us this about his reputation as an anti-vaxxer.
I've never been anti-vaccine. I've said that for 20 years. That's a pejorative that is applied to me in order to silence the legitimate questions I have about vaccine safety and efficacy.
And this about his views on 9/11.
Do I have doubts about 9/11? It's not something I've looked into. So I wouldn't take a position on it until I'd studied it. I don't accept government orthodoxies. I just don't.
Well, he's got some time since 9/11 to look into it. Major Garrett joins us now. He's looked into a lot of the Kennedy background and what he said recently. Good morning to you, Major. You also asked Kennedy about an apology text that he recently sent to a woman who had accused him of sexual assault. What did he say in this apology text?
That's right, Tony. This arises from an article that appeared in the Vanity Fair magazine earlier this month. It talks about a woman named Eliza Cooney, who in 1998 was a part-time babysitter for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his family. She was 23 at the time, and she told Vanity Fair that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on more than one occasion groped her and made her feel sexually threatened or sexualized. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told me he has no memory of this at all, said it doesn't sound like his character, but acknowledged having sent Eliza Cooney a text after the Vanity Fair piece appeared apologizing. I asked Kennedy, is it possible you might have to apologize to other women? And I want to get this directly. He said, it's quite possible. I'm 70 years old. I had a very rambunctious life, unquote.
Okay, we're going to back up out of that detail and get into the general crush of political news in the last 2 weeks. And I'm curious, how has that news affected Kennedy's campaign?
It feels very much as if it has passed the Kennedy campaign by. Republicans are unified and moving forward. Democrats quite clearly are unified and enthused in ways they simply weren't before President Biden stepped aside. All of that has focused attention squarely on former President Trump and now the emerging presumptive Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. feels very much cast to the side.
All right, Major, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Everybody's on their cell phone. These are addictive that have to be controlled. Only about 20% of the radiation goes for communication. The rest is diffused into your body, which explains a lot of things. Children, of course, are very vulnerable to these things because their brains are developing.
Yeah, there's some cell phones that are better than others.
The Apple phones are the worst. We need somebody like yourself to put a bit of order in the house, in my opinion.
Hey, everybody, my guest today, Dr. Paul Héroux, is probably the top expert in the field of bioelectric physics and radio frequency radiation and the impacts of radio frequency radiation on nature and human beings. Dr. Paul Héroux is a scientist with experience in physics. He has a PhD in physics and engineering and the health sciences. He started his research career at the Institut de Recherche of Hydro-Québec in Varennes, Quebec, an internationally reputed electrotechnical laboratory, the biggest electric company in Canada. After rounding out his formation with courses in biology and medicine, he became interested in public health and was appointed associate professor of McGill University's Faculty of Medicine, where he is the current occupational health program director. He is, as I said, an expert in toxicology and electromagnetic radiation. And I won a lawsuit about cell phone radiation, suing FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, in 2021. And we sued FCC because the science that they were using to defend their lack of regulation of cell phone Wi-Fi radiation, the science had overwhelmed it. There was no science behind it. They said their assumption was that until that radiation began to raise the temperature of your body or your organs, in other words, you wanted microwaving you and cooking you, that there were no subthermal effects. And this is wrong. And there are literally, I was shocked, and Paul Rowe can tell us whether this is hyperbole, but there were over 10,000 studies out there over the years showing, raising concerns about Wi-Fi radiation and showing that indeed there are subthermal impacts. The cells in your body act as little antennas that are regulating electric currents and energy currents and flow between all of the functions of your body, and the way that you think, the way that you feel, the way that your immune system works, the way that you move. It's all regulated by electrical impulses that your cells regulate, and that the cell tower when near you disrupts that. And does a lot of other bad stuff, but in all so we won that lawsuit, and FCC this was during the Trump administration. The head of the FCC at that time was a Verizon lobbyist, and they have ever since then blocked anything from happening. So they're essentially required, the implied in this lawsuit was that in the decision by the Federal Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., was that they need to start a new rulemaking. They need to do a real assessment of what Wi-Fi radiation. There are solutions to it, and we're going to talk about those, but that's where we are in the federal case. I wanted to bring Paul on here because he, better than anybody else that I know, can explain what happens to radio frequency regulation, radiation inside the human body. So, Paul, welcome to my podcast. It's a delight to finally meet you in person.
Thank you.
So, tell us, what does Wi-Fi radiation or radio frequency radiation do when it gets into the human body? Why should we be concerned about this?
Well, the 10,000 studies that you mentioned are not there by luck. They are there because there are actually health effects of electromagnetic radiation. The reason why so many governments would believe that there are no effects can seem to be a mystery. But it's not a mystery to me because I'm a fairly old man, as you can see, and I was there when all of these I would say these strategies were being developed. In other words, industry desperately wanted to have very high standards. And this was done in the days of the microwave ovens, when this was the new wonder application. But industry realized that electromagnetic radiation had tremendous potential for commercial applications. So you'll have to consult the law to determine whether this was done, I would say, in the underhanded way or not. But what they came up with is that this radiation is not dangerous, and they had three great arguments that they could present to the public and to politicians who, as you know, don't have too much time to deal with things like that. They said, well, this radiation is non-ionizing. Secondly, they said the radiation levels that we emit are too weak. And thirdly, they said there are no mechanisms to explain the action of these fields on the body. Unfortunately, all three of these arguments are completely false from the scientific point of view. And the thing that I came up with relatively recently is that they should have known better, and they did not. And if you look at the science, basically the problem is, can this radiation trigger certain reactions in human bodies that could interfere or make them sick? And so we call this essentially the concept of energy of activation. What does it take to make changes in the human body from radiation? And what they use, in fact, are concepts that date to 1889. It's called the Arrhenius equation. And what this says is that you have to break a certain amount of energy in order to trigger a chemical reaction. The thinking is simple. You have to break something before it can come back together in a different way. So they use this concept to say that it's non-ionizing because indeed the radiation is non-ionizing. So they thought this is a really good thing to present to the public. And then they said the radiation is too weak. In other words, it cannot ionize, so consequently it can't do anything. And then show us the mechanisms that allow these reactions to occur. Well, there's something very interesting about the human body. The human body has as its first characteristic that it organizes things. And this is a bit hard to digest from the second law of thermodynamics, which is universally accepted in physics. If you organize things, you have in a corresponding way to generate disorganization. This disorganization occurs in all living systems, and it's called reactive oxygen species or unstable molecules. Now, once you understand this, that living systems have to generate free radicals, then they become vulnerable to fields that are extremely weak. And so what this means is that the argument of radiation is too weak no longer holds, and then there are no mechanisms. I can describe in detail at least two mechanisms that are able to alter your rate of cancer and that are able to enter your rate of diabetes. So, in other words, industry had no science to stand on, but they fed these stories to politicians and to the public.
You know, many years ago, I had a radio show called Ring of Fire. This was back in the, I think, mid-2000s or early 2000s, but I had a guy on that time I've met many times since, named Dr. George Carlo. And Dr. George Carlo was what we would call an industry biostitute. He was a guy who had good credentials, but he was a mercenary scientist, and he would be hired by industry to reach certain preordained results that the industry wanted to have a scientific study that validated some profit-taking enterprise that they had already determined they wanted to do. And they hired George Carlo to look at cell phone radiation because, as you know, back around 2013, Congress and the GAO were putting tremendous pressure on FCC to start doing real science and regulating cell phone radiation, which they were doing in Russia and other countries. Russia had this tremendous amount of science, early science in this area, and they are very, very strict in their regulations over there. And Congress was getting worried about it. There were people coming in sick. There were, Americans were complaining about it. And they started pressuring the industry. So the industry, in order to defend itself, hired George Carlo. And they wanted him to do a report clearing it all and saying that it was all as safe as can be. And he was a guy who was capable of doing that stuff. But he had a conscience. And he started reading the science. And the science was so overwhelming. He was finding rat studies from Europe that, they put a cell phone next to a rat for even a couple of minutes. And the EEGs on that rat would not turn back to normal for days. The same thing with children. and that there was evidence then that it was opening up the permeability of the blood-brain barrier in people's brains. And, he started finding this. They'd given him $26 million to do this study, and he gave the money back, and he said, I can't do it. And then he went public, and he shocked the industry. And, he turned out to be a very brave man, and he's been working, I think, ever since to expose it. But that was my first exposure to how bad this is and how overwhelming the science was on it.
Yes, I think your description is very, very accurate. The fact is that when industry was confronted with this problem, you're dealing essentially with the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. They didn't really have any indigenous expertise. And the people that they acquired nor naturally seemed pressure to tell the industry what it wanted to hear. So essentially what happened is that in this process, in the end, industry avoided the problem and tried to find arguments so that the public and even their own constituency, I mean, you're talking about 400,000 engineers, that they would all believe that this radiation is offensive. And if you start to broadcast these ideas, amongst engineers, with 400,000 people, it's very powerful. And they are the ones who hold the expertise on electromagnetism. But of course, their assessment of science was extremely superficial. They didn't want to get into it. They felt it was not their venue. And what Carlo dealt with is all this health evidence coming from epidemiologists and so on. But one thing that I know is that when epidemiologists talk to engineers, it's very difficult to find a common ground. They don't understand each other. And so consequently, even today, we are in a situation in which industry is resting on very, very non-existent science, really. And do you want to know how the tests were conducted to determine that this radiation was safe? Well, they were very short-term tests. Essentially, the military wanted to know if we have a pilot in an F-16, and this pilot is obviously subjected to the radiation of his radar, does the radiation impair his function, his ability to understand situations, his ability to follow orders? And so they ran very short-term tests on a series of rats and monkeys. That's 40 to 60 minutes on monkeys, like 5 monkeys, 10 rats, things like that. And the criterion that they used to determine the safety level was, are these animals reducing their ability to feed themselves? Because they would have a pellet that they could press, and that would deliver a morsel of food to them. So they increased the radiation until these animals reduced their intake of food. And so on the basis of these very simplistic tests, the industry ran away and said, this is what we're going to use. You have to ask yourself, can a test that lasts 40 to 60 minutes represent, the span of human life of 70 years, or the effect on humans over many generations? So it's rather humiliating to think how all of this was done and was arranged.
Yeah, and so now we also have tests showing that this is hurting people, that, animals, that wildlife, that even trees are affected by it. Tell us, what is the bad news? I mean, how bad is this? There's people getting, I'm representing a lot of people who have what they call cell phone tumors, who are of glioblastomas in their brains. So, and my uncle, Ted Kennedy, died of one of those tumors. And the people who are getting these tumors, my colleague, Johnny Cochran, another attorney, had what he thought he understood to be a cell phone tumor that he died from. And you're seeing people get these tumors right behind the ears where they favor with their cell phones. But so far, we're not seeing the science come out to support it. We're seeing a lot of anecdotal evidence and some science on the cancer issues. But on the other issues, the science is pretty overwhelming, isn't it?
Yes. For example, in the case of cancer, imagine that you have one cell that is mutated in your body. It's very well known that in a normal human body, you have full of mutations that do not develop into cancer, for years and years and years. But imagine that you have an agent like electromagnetic radiation that is applied to this cell. What does the radiation do? It changes the level of metabolism in cells. In other words, when you apply it, the metabolism goes down. And when you release the radiation, the metabolism goes back up. Now, if you culture cells and you expose them to various levels of radiation, you will find that from one cancer cell of one type, this kind of electromagnetic treatment will increase the diversity of cells that you have. Some will have more chromosomes than the first original cell. Some will have fewer, and so on and so forth. By increasing the diversity of cancer cells within the body, you increase the malignancy of the tumor itself, and you can trigger its appearance. And so there's plenty of evidence that an agent like electromagnetic radiation, which is a modulator of metabolism, can have these effects on cancer specifically. And this evidence has been around for a long, long time, but as you know, industry has fought the evidence and claimed that the science isn't good. Science is always complicated at the best of times, but when you survey the whole thing, some conclusions can be reached, just in the legal case that you mentioned.
And another impact was to increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The brain is a special organ in the body. It's responsible for so many things. And by and large, the perfusion of blood into the brain is highly controlled. In certain regions like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, it's rather permeable because you want the brain to get proper messaging from what happens in the body. But overall in the brain, it's hard to get from the blood into neural tissue. Well, plenty of evidence showed that when you are subjected to even non-thermal levels of electromagnetic radiation that are perfectly fine with the FCC, you increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. This was documented usually by penetration of albumin, which is a protein that you have in large amounts in your blood. But the problem with albumin is that albumin is a buffer against all the toxicants in your body. Basically, when you have an acute exposure to high concentrations of a toxicant, albumin gobbles up most of it in order to release it to your tissues progressively, thereby lowering the shock. When you allow albumin to penetrate into your nervous tissue, all of these toxins that are accumulated by albumin have access to your brain as well. So it's obvious physiologically that this type of permeation of the blood-brain barrier is a fundamental risk to the brain itself.
And what happens to the brain when you allow toxics into the brain?
Well, I think any toxicology specialist can tell you, the brain is supposed to be relatively immune to these chemicals, and all of a sudden you allow entry into a delicate tissue. This tissue, the brain, is very dependent on supplies of ATP. You know that if you stop breathing right now, you will lose consciousness very, very rapidly because your nervous system depends on the high amount of ATP being generated continuously by the supply of oxygen into your brain. So this is a highly delicate tissue, and if you start allowing all sorts of toxicants. And these toxicants can be almost anything, because whatever you were exposed to that the brain did not allow into neural tissue, whatever your exposure now can get into around neurons that actually are the functioning part of your brain.
And will that interfere with, that will cause inflammation or interfere with brain function at some point?
These toxicants that are allowed into the brain can do that by themselves. But we also know that the radiation itself is well known to increase reactive oxygen species, in tissues. And these reactive oxygen species are essentially molecules that have been activated to be, I would say, hostile to tissue that is healthy. So when you suppress metabolism in any cell, it's a little bit like you have a garden hose and you're watering your lawn, and then you take the hose and you bend it so that the water can't come out anymore. Well, behind you, if there are any leaks on your hose, they will quickly spurt some water, spurts that weren't there before. And so those are the losses of metabolism, and we know exactly where they occur in complex 1 and complex 3 of oxidative phosphorylation. So you suppress metabolism, you are going to increase reactive oxygen species in tissues. This has been repeatedly demonstrated in relation to radiofrequency radiation exposure. So these reactive oxygen species, by their very nature, are hostile when they are in excessive quantities. And when they're present in the brain, of course, they can do damage. Now, all of these chronic diseases can be linked to excesses ROS. We're talking about things like diabetes, things like Alzheimer's, things like Parkinson's, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. All of these chronic neurological diseases are connected with ROS. And microwave radiation can produce an increased concentration of these things.
The woman who initially brought this lawsuit to me, the federal lawsuit, was a woman named Daphne Takover, and you may have met her. She was an officer in the Israeli Defense Force for a long time, and she was a cyber warfare expert. So she was basically in a compartment that was filled with electronics and getting radiated all the time. And at some point, she developed literally overnight a sensitivity to it. And after that, she had to move to the Catskills. She couldn't be around. It's very, very hard to get away from radio frequency radiation nowadays because they're saturating the globe with it. There are cell towers everywhere. It's coming from satellites now. And so she had to move to a remote area of the Catskills. But she could come into rooms in my house and say, this room is heavily radiated. And I had a meter, and every time that she said that, she was absolutely accurate. I've since then met many, many people who have this kind of sensitivity, including a lot of children who get very, very sick. Even small exposures to cell phones or to radiation, and it's very much complicated their lives. Can you explain that and talk about that, your own experience with people who are sensitized? How many people are like that?
People believe that it's between 2 and 3% of people who are aware of it and take defensive measures in order to combat these environmental exposures. Now, the mechanisms are probably exactly the same as the one that we discussed. Essentially, when you generate reactive oxygen species, your nervous system and your immunity can become sensitized to it, and the nervous system will react. Now, I know of cases where children who are electrosensitive would find in a classroom the one spot where the radiation was lowest. And I would go in with my instrument and I would realize, oh, this is where he sits, right? And these people know spontaneously how to defend themselves against the radiation. But indeed, they become ostracized from society. And some people are very sensitive, not only to radio frequency radiation, but also to radiation from power systems and even from static electricity. So it can become a very, very disturbing syndrome that changes your life completely. And the fear that us, public health people have is that as we increase the level of radiation, are we going to magnify and increase correspondingly the number of people who are afflicted by this condition? And nobody wants that to happen. Now, the mechanisms of increases in reactive oxygen species is a mechanism that can, I would say, solicit many physiological processes. And that explains why all people who are electromagnetically sensitive don't have exactly the same symptoms. I know a woman whose left eye closes each time there is radiation, and very reliably. For other people, they will get a headache. That depends on individual physiology and sometimes on the variables of the exposure, because as you know, our electric environment is extremely complicated. It's a mixture of all sorts of ingredients. And for this reason, it has been very difficult to unravel the science of it. Another aspect is that when people try to do experiments, they are rarely in a position in which they can provide a completely radiation-free environment as a baseline in their research. This has made the whole field of bioelectromagnetics very complicated. I would say the reactive oxygen species is a dominant mechanism, also changes in metabolism, and that is essentially happening. There's also a third mechanism that I know of. This is less known. It's called the Rothschild mechanism. This is a mechanism by which radiation changes the pH in the fluid, even in water. And so all of these things together can create extremely complicated effects and syndromes. And these EHS people come with all sorts of symptoms regularly and phone me and ask for help.
Now, you've said, and this is very, very well established in the science that the principal exposure to most people from radiation is one, cell towers that are near your home or near your place of business, and then also, probably the worst, putting a cell phone next to your head. Can you talk about that? And can you talk about particularly children, that are now, we've got a generation of kids that are growing up, sleeping inches from their cell phones, having their cell phones in bed with them at night. I have to, I tell my kids this, because I'm involved in these issues. I read the science, I'm alarmed, but I can't convey my alarm to my kids. They just don't believe it. And, I have to go in their rooms at night from when they were little and take the cell phone out of the beds. They sleep with them next to their pillows. What is this doing, and what are your feelings about that?
Well, what you're fighting is something very powerful. People instinctively believe that if government allowed something on the market, it must be fine. And they don't realize that there's intimate connections between government and industry. And so if industry is given too much leeway, you are appealing, you're looking for catastrophes. You probably remember this guy, Adam Smith, right? 1776. He's the father of capitalism.
Capitalism, yeah.
Yes. But in The Wealth of Nations, he warns us. He says, do not let the merchants take the control of the laws. These people have in the past harmed populations. But in the United States, apparently the FCC has been labeled a captured agency, and it is not the only one. So we need somebody like yourself to put a bit of order in the house, in my opinion. And so in view of your experience with corporations generally. I think you would be a great man to do that. I wish you the best of luck. Now,
I want to point out that plug for me was not rearranged.
it's very spontaneous. I admire a lot some of the statements that you make about government. We need government, but government should not be a substitute for the people. And in some ways, this is exactly what it is trying to do. In most industrial nations, governments now control the majority of the money flow in a country. That means that government changes its own ideas about itself. But going back to the exposure, depending on whether you consider that high-intensity exposures or chronic exposures, which over a long period of time are the most important. Some people would say that the cell phone is the dominant exposure because it radiates into your head at very high intensities. In fact, when you put a cell phone against your head, only about 20% of the radiation goes for communication. The rest is diffused into your body, which explains a lot of things. So intense exposures from cell phones, but cell phone towers are active all the time. So they contribute smaller levels, but if you multiply them by the time of exposure for most people, unless you use a cell phone professionally, they would be the strongest source of exposure. So all of these things together will get worse over time as engineers who have no limits in their imagination think up things like the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies. They would like everything to communicate with everything else. But this is, in my opinion, a philosophy that is wrong-headed. We don't need every grain of sand to communicate with every other grain of sand. And we need privacy. We need a decent environment to live in that is protected from the invasions of the engineers who feel that whatever they can do is appropriate.
What would you tell a parent about, who's got kids sleeping with their cell phones and putting them next to their heads? What advice would you give them? What's the best way to minimize that? And what would you do to frighten them about, appropriately?
Well, I would tell them, please protect their sleeping environment because you may not have control over what happens in schools and elsewhere, but you can at least control their bedrooms. You have to make sure that in their bedrooms, both low-frequency magnetic fields from baseboard heaters are low, as well as the radio frequencies from the routers or something like that. These should be extinguished at night. And how do I scare them? Well, dying from cancer or from any chronic disease at a very, very low age is a very dramatic thing. And being impaired in your learning, because after all, this radiation is known to have impacts on the brain. It alters memory in some ways that are subtle, but that are nonetheless there. Experiments on animals confirm this extensively. So if you want to protect the future of your child, and remember that they will be exposed to this radiation a lot longer than us adults were, because for us, it's a relatively recent invention. For them, it will be lifelong exposure. And the danger is that we will get used to new rates of cancer, new rates of diabetes, new rates of Alzheimer's, new rates of Parkinson's that will become entirely normal because practically the whole population is being exposed. In other words, there are no controls left. So wire your house for internet wiring and reduce your use of wireless. I don't think we'll get use of wireless completely. It will still be around, but it simply has to be managed in such a way that we reduce risks, in particular to chronic diseases.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a minute, the solution, because you actually have it pretty elegant and and workable solution, which is the future in fiber optic cable, which is better for our privacy. It's better for ending the surveillance state. It will protect nature, protect our bodies, protect our children's health. It will protect us against chronic disease, all of that. I want to get into that in a minute, but tell us, what are other countries doing? How does the U.S. compare to European countries? I know in some of the European countries, they're restricting cell phones for kids in schools. And what Russia's doing, Russia knows a lot about this because they tried to develop it as a weapon originally.
Mm-hmm.
And use radio frequency radiation, and it appears that people are using it as a weapon. We're seeing the Havana syndrome, and there's a lot of speculation about whether that's radio frequency weaponry. But talk about that, about what's happening in other countries, and also, if you can, about the use of it as a weapon.
As far as other countries, in France, they discourage the use of wireless in kindergarten, and in schools they ask the children to leave their cell phones at the door, and it's that simple. And I think they're doing this because they apprehend the risk of the radiation, but also because they believe that it's not conducive to proper learning. I mean, I've always wondered, I'm a professor in a university, and I am in front of class, and all of these students in front of me have their laptops open with Wi-Fi provided by the university. Are they doing some homework, from the previous class? What are they doing exactly? I do want them to look up information that would be relevant to the discussion in class. But what it means is that essentially you are curtailing, diminishing, attenuating any discussion that could happen in class normally, because essentially everybody can go their own way. And socially, this is a catastrophe. You see it even in very simple countries where people used to meet in the public place on Sundays and talk. And after the advent of cell phones, everybody's on their cell phone. These are addictive devices that have to be controlled because you have a science that's being developed to capture attention. And this attention is subtracted from family life and from intellectual life. So I never understood personally why in a class you don't want all the students to be attentive to what's happening. And we encourage people on the basis of what? I have no idea. On the basis of laissez-faire, that a salesman told you that this will be a boon to education. And children, of course, are very vulnerable to these things because their brains are developing. And so any signs, and there are many, that the brain does not all develop in the same way when it's subjected to this radiation are quite alarming.
All right, let's talk about solutions. What is the solution? One of the things that you've talked a lot about is fiber optic cables. And how would that solve the problem?
Clinton promised the U.S. population that they would get fiber to the home, didn't he? And what happened instead is that the industry took in the money and developed wireless. So the promise that President Clinton had made perfect technical sense. You want to provide people with speed and with access to the world through the internet. And essentially, when industry took that contract up, they perverted it to a wireless, I would say, deployment simply because they thought that they could make more money that way. And so I believe myself that businesses and private households should have wired optical fiber, which has a potential for speed that is enormously higher than what wireless has. And secondly, it is energy very, very efficient. We have to think in terms of the energy that we need to spend per bit or byte of data that we're transmitting, because apparently the appetite of people for data is very, very large. So we have to be thoughtful of how we transmit information, lest, a large proportion of U.S. electrical power is completely absorbed by, telecommunications devices. So this is very, very important. So fiber to businesses and to the home is one thing. A second thing that is coming up that may become very important is Li-Fi. We believe that the frequencies of radiation that are visible or very near to the infrared might be less physiologically hazardous because living systems have had a very long time to adapt to this radiation. Whereas the microwave and radio frequency radiations are entirely new to the environment. In other words, there was none of this before the development of radio frequency techniques. So by using infrared and Li-Fi, we could potentially restore our ability to have wireless at much, much, much reduced risks. So I'm not saying that Li-Fi will not be found one day to have some risks, but we have been using Li-Fi for some applications for some time. We've used headsets that are using infrared, for example. And I don't believe that there are reports that this has been found to be deleterious. We have had remote controls for television for a long time that were also infrared. So there is this belief that infrared radiation will be much less dangerous than radio frequencies, simply because we have had about 3 billion years to get used to this type of radiation.
In terms of personal use, my practice is that I never put the cell phone next to my head. I keep it on the speaker all the time, and I hold it away from my body. Do headsets work or earphones?
Well, if you're using an air tube, it is a very good insulation, of course. Now, if you're using a normal ear set, well, this has a wire that's leading into your ear, so it's not quite as good insulation as an air tube, which is entirely non-electrical. But there's many alterations that could be made. You could have a cell phone that emits infrared radiation, and you could have something on your head that receives this infrared radiation, and that would be a big gain, because in a cell phone, you indeed have a lot of radio frequency radiation that is funneled right into your head.
How about AirPods?
Yeah. Well, the problem with those is that they're not very, very powerful, but you stick them right into your ear. So the dose that you get from such devices is very hard to measure for a couple of reasons. Since they are low power, they get an exemption when they're approved. So you're not obligated to investigate how they irradiate your tissues. And making measurements inside your ear while you're using an AirPod is even more difficult than assessing the radiation from a cell phone. For a cell phone, you know how they do it generally. They use a mixture of water, salt, and sugar that they sort of stir together, and they put the cell phone above this solution, and they determine how much it heats up the solution. This is very, very crude and simple. At least it's something. In the case of an earpod, it's very hard to know. There is no requirement to specify it. So we're being more and more inundated with these devices that are assumed on the basis of a bunch of monkeys and rats for 40 to 60 minutes to have no effect on you for your lifetime. How nice is that?
Okay, apps. I remember just reading when I was preparing for the case for the argument, and the Court of Appeals case, reading some studies that show that the more apps you have on the phone, the more radiation that's coming out. But are there, and in the same question, are there some cell phones that are better than others?
Yeah, the Apple phones are the worst. That's very, very clear.
Yeah, the Apple phones are the worst.
Yes. And you notice that all these electrical devices have something in common. The computer initially, they used an operating system called DOS. DOS answered the commands of the user. And then some more sophisticated operating systems came into being, like Windows, for example. And what you notice of them is that the operating system took a lot of initiatives. On its own, it did things. And over time, progressively, we have lost control of computers. In other words, you feel that they're owned by the people who sold them to you. They have these updates and these inevitable, I would say, appendages to the software that provide you with publicity. And exactly the same thing is happening to cell phones. You place them on airplane mode, yet they will still emit radiation because the owner is actually the company who programs them and who updates the software in it automatically. So it is an invasion because with electronics and programming, it is possible to do that.
And the more apps that you have on your cell phone, the more radiation you're getting.
They're all little individuals that have their own desires to communicate with the outside. So if it's a weather service, how often do you want the weather? I think, in my opinion, cell phones should still be yours. They should respond to your desires and your commands and not push information to you and not suggest things to you about your behavior or wake you up at one moment or another unless you want to. So you're being relieved of control by artificial intelligence devices that are under the control and the interests of others.
Okay, weaponization. The Havana syndrome, is that coming from Wi-Fi weapons?
Well, you all know about this application that is very, very open about using, say, 100 gigahertz radiation to heat up the skin of protesters so that they flee away from a location. This is a very, very simple application based on heat only. But for this kind of application, you need essentially, I would say, large emitters. You need antennas that are fairly cumbersome to carry around. So when you see these things appearing at the site of your manifestation, you will not miss them. Now, the more subtle effects of mind control with the radiation, in my opinion, mind control, as is very happens in science, this is a bit of an exaggeration. I think they can probably disrupt your mind with it, but the view that the government takes control of your mind in this way, I think is a little bit fantasy. But if you're really willing to do it, you can probably make people sicker by simply exposing them to radiation in excessive levels. I mean, that's totally in the realm of possibilities. I don't think we have...
Could that be targeted to like a single apartment or a single person so that you could remotely, have a weapon that would direct like a ray towards one apartment or any individual if you wanted to harm that person rather than, the general public?
There are probably some frequencies that are more appropriate for this. You've all probably heard that with 5G, for example, you have what we call beamforming. What this means is that instead of having an antenna that broadcasts in a very, very general way, say in a third of the space around it, it forms a beam that is really focused. And this beam, of course, can also be very intense because it's a result of an antenna that has many, many small elements that are coordinated in order to achieve such an effect. Once you try to beam it into an apartment, you have to consider, does this radiation go through the apartment, the walls of the apartment, the windows of the apartment? Once it gets in there, is the target in direct line of sight, or is it going to have to bounce around? And if it does bounce around, does it represent a little bit of a microwave oven-like, situation, or is it going to be quickly attenuated? So it requires a certain level of skill to be able to, I would say, pinpoint and target somebody. But just to cause damage, the requirements are much, much, much lower in terms of knowledge.
Okay, driverless cars. Do we need 5G for driverless cars? You can't do that with fiber optics.
I never thought for the life of me that there was need in any way for driverless cars to have wireless. I think driverless cars can be built with cameras that are very fast and look around them the same way that the driver does. I think it's simply a habit or a mannerism of the industry to want to implant radiation and networking in everything. Basically, the dealer wants to know ahead of the car driving into the garage, who he is and what his scheduled maintenance is. Very, very nice. But I think that to drive on a highway, you need to see the highway. And I think that the image analysis that is necessary for this is not quite within our reach. You would have to have roads that are specially designed. And if you have a big system of out-route, probably it's possible to do this. But it could be entirely done with vision, as opposed to being done with wireless and creating a huge network, which makes your car a spy wherever you leave it on the street. Because after all, once it's wired and, in communication, you have a fleet of vehicles that can probably hear things and probably see things.
Do you have, what's your hope? What's your hope for the future? You're not a pessimistic man. You're a happy man and very idealistic. And what do you see as the good future for us?
May I be honest?
Yeah.
I think you are the hope for the future, because you are one of these few politicians that doesn't seem tied to all sorts of interests. And I think you see the government process and the processes of society more clearly than certainly all the other candidates in the United States, and possibly better than all the politicians of the world. I really respect the work that you are doing, and I have high hopes for your future.
All right. Well, I want to tell everybody I was not fishing for that, but thank you very much. And then tell us where people can reach you. Dr. Paul Heroux, where do they reach you? And by the way, is Heroux.
That's right. And they can reach me by email at paul.heroux@mcgill.ca. McGill is the university where I teach in Montreal.
Yeah. Well, we all know McGill University. Thank you very much, Dr. Heroux. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Robert. The best of luck to you.
Thank you. Please go to Kennedy24.com.
Now there's still a few months before early voting in the next presidential election begins. And Texas Democrats are trying to keep independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. off the ballot. They sent a letter to the Texas Secretary of State claiming that Kennedy failed to submit the number of signatures required to appear on the ballot. Kennedy says he turned in 245,000 signatures to the state, but the Democrats claim that nearly 70% of those signatures were invalid. In order for a signature to count, it must be from a registered Texas voter and include their address, their date of birth or voter registration number, the date they signed it, and their printed name. And they must be from people who did not take part in the general primary election. If the Texas Democratic Party's claim is true, Kennedy would fall short of the number of signatures required for him to appear on the ballot. In a statement to KVUE, his campaign disputes that, saying they do have enough valid signatures. We reached out to the Texas Secretary of State's office, but they were not able to comment publicly on the process.
Thank you. Director, I'll try to ask questions that are answerable too. I think that's been done pretty well on both sides. You do the advanced threat assessment and deliver that information as to the general threat and then specifics as to protected people to the Secret Service. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. The Secret Service does a threat assessment, but they're doing that based on intelligence that they receive from a number of sources, including, of course, the FBI. So we share, whenever we have threat information related to a particular individual or protectee, then we share it with the Secret Service at a number of levels.
So you're a participant, but ultimately the responsibility for threat assessment as to these individuals belongs to the Secret Service.
Well, again, the threat assessment for the individual belongs to the Secret Service, but we are an important part of that because we share threat information, if we have any. They get threat information from a variety of sources.
So, and you get them from that same variety of sources. They've got no sources that are excluded from the FBI, do they?
Well, I don't know. I'm not aware of any that are excluded from the FBI, but they may receive information that comes directly to them that didn't come to us.
Sure. Okay. Director, do you believe that former President Trump was a high-risk threat under your assessment?
Well, I believe that former President Trump, really, frankly, like any president or former president, is a very high-profile figure and attracts a lot of, unfortunately, of the kind of threats we've been talking about.
It's fair to say, not on a scale of 1 to a million with little nuances, but on a scale of 1 to 10, President Trump's risk was very similar to a current president, very similar to, because he was the presumptive nominee and leading in the polls and so on, that he was a high risk by any standard. Is that correct?
Certainly, there's a reason why he has so much protection around him.
Okay. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of assassinated senator and the nephew of an assassinated president, would you say he was also, as a presidential candidate, at significant risk?
Again, I think any presidential candidate raises some level of risk. It might vary from candidate to
candidate. But it's clearly a risk. Okay. In a nutshell, the day before this attack, President Trump was documented not to have gotten on multiple occasions from the Secret Service what they asked for. The day after, it looks like they're getting more. The day before, RFK had been denied by the president multiple times, Secret Service protection. The day after, he now has it. So now my question is the actions of a 20-year-old with a lone gunman on a roof sufficient to change the risk assessment in your mind for President Trump and RFK, or are we just realizing the threat that was always there and being more appropriate in matching it? And I know that's a little vague, but you've been at this for a long time. Hindsight is 20/20. Now that we have hindsight, is it fair to say that giving Robert F. Kennedy Jr. security, upping the security, including drones, overhead support for the president, former president, these are all things that in hindsight should have been done the day before?
Well, let me try to answer your question this way. Of course, as I said, the assessments of the level of security to be provided to individual protectees.
No, I understand it's a Secret Service decision.
But what I would say to you is that, and I've been saying for quite some time, including in front of committees of this Congress, that we are in an elevated threat environment, and we have been for some time. And that comes from a variety of quarters. It is, quite frankly, a dangerous time to be a prominent public official.
And in regards to that, the other side has spent a lot of time talking about what people on the right have said. But there was an attempted assassination on a Supreme Court justice. We have had the highest ranking senator on the other side of this body, saying that there were actions, that they were accountable. We have had multiple members of Congress in both the House and the Senate berating the character of members of the Supreme Court as a result of their decisions made, both, sometimes 6-3, sometimes unanimous, whatever. Are those comments, not any one of them, but are those comments and the generation of that sort of, oh, this guy's bad for democracy, this Supreme Court justice is a threat to democracy, is that the kind of thing that raises the threat level, and would you caution against that?
Well, I do believe that we've seen an increase in threats of violence, which again, that's the FBI's lane, not rhetoric, no matter how despicable or heated it is, but violence and threats of violence. We have seen an uptick in threats towards judges, among other prominent public officials, including, as you say, a case that we helped investigate involving a threat to a sitting Supreme Court justice.
An attempt.
An attempt.
Yeah, thank
correct.
you.
Right. I think it's a reflection of a broader phenomenon that we are seeing in this country, where people, again, very passionate, I respect that, very angry, I respect that, but there's a right way and a wrong way to express yourself when you're angry. And violence and threats of violence just can't be it. And that's where we fit in. It's not my role as FBI director to call out particular people's rhetoric. There's a place for that, but that's not my role as FBI director. But when it turns to violence and threats of violence, that has to be treated as unacceptable, and that's the way we look at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Director Wynn. We're joined now by the independent presidential candidate who tried to challenge Joe Biden for the Democrat nomination, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Robert, great to have you back on Uncensored again. It feels like every time I interview you, something quite extraordinary has just happened. And we talk about the latest development in what was supposed to be a really dull race, but has turned into this electrifying kind of soap opera, albeit with very serious consequences. Let me just, first of all, talk about Joe Biden's resignation with you. Should he stand down as president? Is it not incongruous for him to say, I'm not fit to continue in the race, which ends in November, but I am fit to continue as president until January?
Yeah, I don't think those were the words that he used. I think what he is saying is that he needs all of his energy to focus on governing the country, and that's why he's withdrawing from the race. So I'm not going to comment on it one way or the other, but I think the die is cast.
But would it not make it easier for Kamala Harris or whoever the nominee ends up being for the Democrats? Would it not make their job easier if they were able, in her case, I mean uniquely, because she'd be doing what it applied to, if she was able to become president, would that not strengthen her position and improve her chances of winning?
It will definitely strengthen her position within the party. I'm not sure that that's the best thing for the Democratic Party. I would think that the best thing for the party is to actually have a democratic process that, where people are either using ranked choice voting, which actually is democratic, or using polls, national polls, where you say who's the most likely Democrat to beat Donald Trump, and actually really opening up the convention to a vote. I think what they're going to do is they're going to have kind of a Potemkin village of democracy. They're going to have a kind of a faux democracy where they pretend it's a democratic process, but Kamala is at the end of every, at the end of every pathway. So I think it's really going to be about picking her vice president, that, there's going to probably be a little bit of democracy there. But as you know, Piers, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I had to get out of the party because they would not have a democratic process. They use, the DNC, which is the elite, 400 elite members of the Democratic Party, decided who was going to be president, which is President Biden. And they rigged the rules to make sure that there was no democracy. And I grew up in a Democratic Party that was fighting to make sure every American got the right to vote for anybody that they wanted to vote for. And today's Democratic Party is just the opposite. It's fighting and spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that, to use the courts, to use the denial of Secret Service protection, to use all of these other mechanisms of power to make sure that President Biden doesn't have anybody to run against. And now Vice President Kamala Harris won't have to really deal with an authentic democracy.
What do you think happens here? We've got 4 months until the election. Do you think it's almost certain that Kamala Harris will be the nominee? Or could you see it genuinely ending up being an open broker convention where it could be one of any number of people?
Yeah, I think it's better for the party and the country if they actually have an open convention. But having seen what I've seen from the Democratic Party, I don't think that that is a likely outcome. But I think it would be better for our country. So, I don't know. I think, I saw what happened during the primaries, where the people who were running, like Dean Phillips and myself and Marianne Williamson, were just shut out. We were told those primaries are not being held anymore. We were told, they passed a law, they passed a rule within the Democratic Party that after they saw me campaigning very, very effectively in New Hampshire, they passed a rule that any candidate who steps foot into the state of New Hampshire, that all of their votes will go for President Biden. So those were the audacity of the kind of new rules they were adopting to make sure that democracy did not function. And I suspect that's the same thing that's going to happen with Kamala now.
I mean, what's interesting, and I think this is probably supportive of your view of what you just expressed, a lot of the front runners have already endorsed her publicly. So even if it went to an open convention, it wouldn't include the likes of Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer and others, because they've already said they're backing Kamala Harris. So they've kind of took themselves out of the race.
Yeah, and I think Kamala has a lot of vulnerabilities that we're gonna hear more and more about over the next 104 days. Oh, Kamala, for one thing, Piers, Kamala was kind of the concealer in chief. She was talking every day, according to her own recounting, to President Biden, and she was the one who was coming out onto the podium and saying there was nothing wrong, that there was no problem. And so clearly she was either she was blind to the kind of thing that we all saw during the debate, or she was trying to protect her own career by putting the country's interests secondary. And I think that that's something that the Trump campaign is going to have billions of dollars to put that story on TV. Vice President Harris was also one of the public officials in California who created these policies that made California 49th in terms of education outcome. Number one, in terms of homelessness, California, 50% of the homeless people in our country live in California. That's not a good record to run on. And I think she has a lot of other vulnerabilities that, that we're going to hear more and more about, and that essentially are going to make her unelectable.
Has anything that's happened in the last 3 weeks, from the debate to the attempted assassination, and I'll come to that separately in a moment, to Biden quitting, has any of that changed how you view your role right now?
Well, I would say that the election now is very dynamic. So, and which offers all kinds of opportunities for me, but I really, I try not to predict the future because I just try not to spin stuff. So, we're doing what we've been doing from the outset, which is to fight for the American middle class, fight to end the chronic disease epidemic, fight to end the war machine, fight to end this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, talking about and fight to get the deficit under control. All of these issues that none of the other candidates are talking about. I would say that the Democratic Party no longer has any authentic relationship with the American middle class. The Democratic Party I knew as a boy that represented cops and firefighters and working people is gone. And then the Republican Party has all kinds of problems with their own. President Trump, who got a huge boost from the assassination attempt, and I commend him for his courage and his leadership during that very, very challenging time. He announced yesterday, according to the New York Post, that he is choosing between Jamie Dimon, who's the head of Morgan, and Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, as his Treasury Secretary. And this is, I think people cannot take seriously his promise that he's going to drain the swamp if he actually once again brings these swamp creatures in to run our government. BlackRock is American middle class is not fond of BlackRock, and they see, all of the machinations, its role in the war in Ukraine, where it's got not only the contracts, because it owns all the military contractors, to blow up Ukraine, all the bridges and ports and schools and hospitals, but it also has the contracts to rebuild Ukraine. And, it owns the credit card companies that are bankrupting Americans, that are charging 32%. All of the economic problems that we have, which are the result of this systematic strip mining of wealth from the American middle class and sending it upward to this new oligarchy of billionaires, it's all been orchestrated by BlackRock. And to bring them in to run the Treasury is not, I think it sends a bad signal. I think it's going to be a vulnerability for President Trump.
Robert, the last time you were on Uncensored, we had a pretty passionate conversation about the fact you were not getting Secret Service protection. You finally were given that protection, but obviously only after Donald Trump had been shot at a rally. First of all, your response to getting it, albeit belatedly.
I'm very grateful for having it. The Secret Service detail I have is very professional. I think they've made me and my family feel very, very safe. And I'm very, very grateful to the Secret Service for finally. And I think I told you at one point, Piers, we actually had repeated conversations with the Secret Service. And from the beginning, the Secret Service wanted to give us protection.
Yes,
and they were being denied that, and they expected us to, and they were being denied that by the White House. So they were very surprised that the White House, or that our, DHS, Secretary Mayorkas, was not allowing. They found that they did their own assessment of me that found that I was at, quote, elevated risk. So they wanted to give it to us from the beginning, and the detail that we've got is really wonderful. I think, what's troubling to me, and I don't want to make this about me, but we've seen this weaponization of the federal agencies, of the enforcement agencies, including the CIA, the CIA, FBI, and even the NIH and the CDC in it being weaponized for political purposes. And, I just won this lawsuit against the Biden administration, Kennedy versus Biden. I just won an injunction against the Biden administration using the FBI and the CIA and NIH and CDC to censor me, to stop the censorship. But we've seen it across the board against President Trump, against other rivals of the president, in a way that I think should be very, very disturbing to the American people. Piers, when my father took over the Justice Department in 1961 for his brother, who was then president, he had a meeting the first week where he called all the branch chiefs and all the division chairs, and he said to them, the one rule in this Justice Department is that no, we never politicize enforcement, that we never ask the question about a defendant, are they Democrat or Republican? we have a responsibility for making sure that the American people believe that in our country, justice is blind, that the enforcement agencies of our country are neutral politically, and that's the only way to maintain faith of the American public in these critical institutions of democracy. So, and I think President Biden really dropped the ball on that. I think, President Trump did too. When he was running, he was talking about, locking up Hillary Clinton and appointing a special prosecutor to do that. And, it's paradoxical that when he got that, now that he's on the outside, he saw those federal agencies weaponized against him in ways that I think the entire country witnessed. But it's not good for our country. We look like a banana republic.
Yeah, completely. And when you saw what happened to Donald Trump a week ago and how close he came to being assassinated, and the full scale of how the Secret Service had dropped the ball in protecting him with this young kid with a rifle on a rooftop just 150 yards or so from where Trump was standing. Do you think that the Director of the Secret Service, Kim Cheetle, who's currently testifying on Congress, should she have already resigned?
I have a lot of questions about how about the coverage, and we're hearing now. We heard this actually from President Trump. I spoke with President Trump soon after, the evening of his shooting, and we talked about the fact that the Secret Service, and he was very complimentary of his Secret Service detail and their bravery in getting up onto the stand very, very quickly and moving him off and protecting him. But even he had some questions. People on his staff told us that they had asked for enhanced Secret Service protection, and that the DHS had denied it to them, and they were comparing their situation to my situation. So I think those questions need to be answered by somebody. I wouldn't necessarily blame the Secret Service till I know more, but I think somebody bungled it. Somebody, obviously, it's obvious from the outcome that there was something going on here that Americans really need to know more about. I'll say this. I think President Trump's first reaction to the shooting, first his bravery on the podium, and then after that, at least the noises he made about unifying the country, I was very touched by that and very hopeful about that. And I don't think it's necessarily turned out that way, but I think at first, and the first 10 minutes of his convention speech were very conciliatory, and I think that's what our country needs now. It needs to be unified. When my uncle was shot, Pierce, in 1963, when he landed in Dallas that day, there were posters all over the city that said, and in fact, advertisements in the leading newspapers in the city that had a picture of my uncle and a wanted poster, wanted dead or alive. And that was an emblem of this, of this polarization that had come out of the civil rights movement, particularly at that time, and the anger at my uncle in some of the southern states, and his shooting in many ways was a product of that boiling anger. But after he died, our country came together in an amazing way. And, he'd been trying to get the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act. And immediately after his death, as a gesture to his memorial, as a memorial gesture to him, Congress, both houses of Congress got together and passed the Voting Rights Act. And, I really would have liked to see that kind of unity. And our country became a true constitutional democracy for the first time in its history as a result of his murder. So, our job on earth is to bring order out of chaos and turn bad things into good things. And I was hoping that the same thing would happen for our country after President Trump's, after the attempted assassination. And, I think he gave us some reason for hope at the outset. I'm not sure if it's holding.
And I spoke to him on Saturday night, and he was remarkably sanguine about what had happened to him, and I was congratulating him that he'd gone back out within a week and was back on another stage at another rally, showing no signs of being put off at all by what had happened to him, which was extraordinary. But he also expressed a hope in that phone call that Joe Biden would stay in the race as long as possible. If it does end up being Kamala Harris v. Donald Trump come November, who wins?
You know, I never make predictions. I stopped making predictions in 2016 after I said that President Trump could never be elected president. So I've tried to be disciplined about not making predictions, and also I really try not to spin stuff. So I'm not going to make that prediction, but I think that right now it seems like it's President Trump's race to lose, but he also is capable of doing that. So I think that 100 days is our light years from now, and so many things could change between now and then, and so I wouldn't make that prediction.
The one prediction I will make is that unpredictable things will happen, because it's turned into the most unpredictable race in history. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it's brilliant to have you back on. Please come back again when inevitably something more outlandish occurs. God knows what it will be, but I think we can pretty well be certain something will. And I appreciate you, as always, you coming on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierce.
All right, so the numbers are finally in, and they are, in a word, game-changing. Whoa. Okay, so that's 2 words, but this is a big deal. In light of the most normal political week of all time, Team Kennedy would like to pile it on today with some incredibly staggering polling data. Now, the quick preface here is that we wanted to test where people stood after they heard Bobby's message from himself, as opposed to the media's version. The poll was meant to be private, but the results were so interesting we have to share. Let's get into it. Zogby Strategies just released a poll with over 1,300 respondents and a margin of error of just 2.8%, so very solid data. In a head-to-head matchup between President Trump and President Biden, it's essentially 50-50, so no surprise there. In a head-to-head matchup between Vice President Harris and President Trump, it's, again, pretty close to 50-50, with Harris doing a few points worse than Biden, so again, no surprise there. But in the head-to-head matchup between President Donald J. Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Kennedy wins by a whopping 14 points, 57-43. This would be a landslide victory for our first independent president since George Washington. Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Green Party, we all would unite under a Kennedy administration. Let's compare this to another Zogby poll from April. It had Kennedy barely ahead of Trump, but still winning. So these numbers suggest that since that horrendous debate, Kennedy is surging. So why isn't the media covering this? Why are they still saying that this is a race between 2 people? To answer that properly, we have to go all the way back to 1992.
Can you explain what internet is?
It's called the Backstreet Boys. I still believe in a place called hope.
It was Democrat Bill Clinton, Republican George Bush, and independent Ross Perot. And we all know what happened.
That's it. Game, set, match. It's over.
Bill Clinton won 43% of the popular vote, while Bush won 37.5%, and Perot garnered 18.9%. But here's something that very few people know. An exit polling firm called Voter Research and Surveys conducted exit polls in 1992, and this is crazy. They revealed that upwards of 40% of the electorate would have voted for Ross Perot if they believed he had a chance to win. If people had voted their conscience in the 1992 election, Clinton's numbers would have gone from 43 to 31, Bush from 38 to 27, and Ross Perot would have been the president. So pre-election polling dramatically underestimated the appeal of Perot's candidacy. But the media in 1992 continued to push this spoiler/wasted vote narrative.
Third-party outsider.
The near impossible.
It's out of his grasp.
But at this point, most agree Perot needs a miracle.
We will landslide this thing if the people vote their conscience.
Had voters, the media, and analysts actually understood Perot had a real shot to win the election, the entire narrative and therefore the dynamics of the election would have been completely different. So something about this story seems vaguely familiar. If Bobby's even talked about in the media, he's talked about in the exact same way.
A spoiler candidate, a spoiler.
Spoiler. Fringe presidential aspirants.
All right, so to sum up, based on the lessons of history and the data that we just received, if people vote their conscience on November 5th, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would be the next president of the United States. But what these lessons teach us also is that we have to believe he can win. We are steeped in a media-induced Stockholm syndrome. We feel beholden to our captors because we're convinced they're the only options we have. So each side spends hours and hours rationalizing the behavior of their person who we all know in our guts does not deserve to be president. We have the opportunity to do something that would completely change our country forever. But we need you now more than ever. If you can contribute $5 or $10 by clicking the link below, we can continue to build momentum toward the first independent president, leading the first true unity government that this country has ever seen. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
There were reports over the weekend that RFK Jr. was seeking a position in a possible Trump administration, maybe as head of Health and Human Services. But in an interview with Piers Morgan yesterday, he criticized Trump for filling his previous administration with corrupt corporate figures, according to him. Let's watch.
I would say that the Democratic Party no longer has any authentic relationship with the American middle class. The Democratic Party I knew as a boy that represented cops and firefighters and working people is gone. And then the Republican Party has all kinds of problems with their own. President Trump, who got a huge boost from the assassination attempt, and I commend him for his courage and his leadership during that very, very challenging time. He announced yesterday, according to the New York Post, that he is choosing between Jamie Dimon, who's the head of Morgan, and Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, as his Treasury Secretary. And this is, I think people cannot take seriously his promise that he's going to drain the swamp. If he actually once again brings these swamp creatures in to run our government, BlackRock is American middle class is not fond of BlackRock, and they see, all of the machinations, its role in the war in Ukraine, where it's got not only the contracts, because it owns all the military contractors, to blow up Ukraine, all the bridges and ports and schools and hospitals, but it also has the contracts to rebuild Ukraine. And, it owns the credit card companies that are bankrupting Americans, that are charging 32%. All of the economic problems that we have, which are the result of this systematic strip mining of wealth from the American middle class and sending it upward to this new oligarchy of billionaires. It's all been orchestrated by BlackRock, and to bring them in to run the Treasury is not, I think it sends a bad signal. I think it's going to be a vulnerability for President Trump.
So there he was, going after Trump. I mean, praising him for how he responded to the assassination, which I agree was courageous and has contributed to maybe rising political fortunes. It's fantastic that he was not killed, and the failures of the Secret Service must be dealt with. And in fact, Kimberly Cheadle has now resigned, as we announced in an earlier segment. But saying that, if the Republican Party wants to be the party of the working class of everyday people, and break from its past perception as a kind of organization that not only is just rewarding or helpful to the rich, but is sort of actively, and this is something both parties do when they get into government, is like changing the rules. Because I'm for free markets, and I'm fine with businesses flourishing, and I want less regulation. But when they put the business people in charge of setting the rules and regulations, then they end up, they can enrich themselves, and then you can have a playing field that is not level, where the most well-connected business kind of figures can make their own lives better and their own firms better. And I think what he was saying there is that is every bit what you could expect from a Jamie Dimon or a Larry Fink, being some of the wealthiest, most influential and powerful business people in the world. They're going to be writing the Treasury Department policies. Will those be policies that benefit everyone, that lift rising tide lifting all boats, or will those be policies that are specifically good for BlackRock?
Right. I think RFK Jr. just needs to stay in the race. He does not need to drop out and endorse anyone. He doesn't need to make any deals to get a cabinet position. He needs to be in the race to say things like this, to be criticizing both parties for being friends with the ruling class, the vampire class of the country. He is right to say BlackRock, which is a financial firm that makes money off of pooling a bunch of money and investing in America's biggest corporations. They have a vested interest in corporations doing very well. That means wages being low and prices being high. It also means things like potentially prolonging the war in Ukraine and lobbying for that, because that's something that they will profit off of, as he pointed out. And regular families that can't make ends meet. A big part of this is rent increases. BlackRock has a ton of real estate investments. And a big part of this is they've taken on debt in order to make ends meet. And now a part of paying their regular bills is paying off interest. He's right to point that out as well. And we just don't see establishment Democrats or Donald Trump talk about this. And so saying a Trump presidency this time around can't be, again, hiring people from this ruling class, this vampire class. And there's a difference between business people who own small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and these people who own and run the major businesses in the country and are honestly running the country into the ground. You can't say you're an administration for the people and have those people in your administration. So he needs to be on the outside criticizing that and maybe make a deal with Trump, say, I'll endorse you if you promise not to put any of these people in your administration.
Yeah, there was reporting, obviously, over the weekend that they had had some kind of conversation, and we played a clip of their phone call they had right after the assassination attempt that was recorded and leaked against RFK Jr.'s wishes, and he apologized to Donald Trump that they did that. Trump, in that phone call, there was no explicit promise made. It sounded like perhaps they were possibly going to discuss or come to some kind of arrangement that if RFK Jr. was going to support Trump, that he would get something out of it. But no, I think he should absolutely remain in the race, and it sounds like he intends to remain in the race. And he's not. And Democrats they've jumped all over this narrative. They're like, oh, he's here to help Trump, and he's just trying to make it so Democrats can't win. But again, he's pulling voters, and the closer he seems to Trump, the more likely he is to actually pull voters from Trump. So if you're a Democrat, it doesn't actually even make sense for you to want him out of you should want him in the race if you think he's actually a secret figure of the right and is only appealing to people on the right. Of course, that's not actually the case. He appeals to some people on the right. He appeals to some people on the left. He appeals to some people in the center. He appeals to some libertarians. He appeals to some people who are just not going to vote for any other candidate, want an outsider. And I think he is having an important impact in the race, talking about some things that, don't get mentioned, like what is the financial incentive for people who will be profiting from the Ukraine war? War is not profitable or good overall for society, but the firm that literally manufactures the weapons, well, it's good for them, and they should not have say over our policy, but do they? And those are important questions to ask. So I'm glad he's still in it, raising those questions, and as I've said before, it was just inexcusable to not have him in that debate that will now go down in history as the debate that ended Joe Biden's quest for a second term. If they do end up doing another debate, I think the possibility of doing it is now up in the air again, because Trump kind of said, I had agreed to debate Joe Biden, not Kamala Harris. Why don't we do it on Fox News? So again, if the rules are up for discussion about what the debate would be, again, RFK Jr. should be in it.
And right now, people are very afraid of political extremism. What they really mean when they say this is on the right, they're afraid of communism, which they describe as this sort of authoritarian government where the government controls the economy, and it's bad. That's what you have when people from BlackRock are serving in an administration. And what do you have the fear of on the left? You have the fear of fascism, the merging together of the corporation and the state. We're describing the same things. Whether or not these are the real definitions, the accepted definitions among Marxists, or the accepted definitions among followers of Mussolini or what have you, I really think that we have common ground in all not wanting this to be reality, and the fact that neither of the major parties, neither of the front-running candidates have talked about this is a crisis. And that's why RFK Jr. is never going to get accepted by either major party, is because he's willing to call that out.
We will be back with more Rising right after this.